Allow us at Eddie B Productions to capture, create, and celebrate all of your greatest moments. Let us turn your joy into memories that will last forever. As we remember our beloved Eddie Blick Jr., the very reason we do it all, we aim to put a smile on your face and also your heart. Whether a birthday party, wedding planning, organizing an event, or photography, we can service all your needs. You can follow us on Instagram at Eddie B Productions, email us at eddie_productions93@outlook.com, or call us at 410-303-0101 for all your event planning, decoration, fun, and photography needs. We look forward to working with you.
You got big dreams, big purpose, big visions on your mind. You just wanna change the world in these crazy times. You got ideas so big, you're scared of the success they may bring. But in your heart, you know you're on to something amazing. Then there's days you feel like you're in over your head. But don't feed your fears, water your dreams instead. 'Cause you're not that far from where you wanna be. It just takes some time and patience. When you're building something, you know I'm building something, you know I'm building something.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Winchell, the Bourgh podcast radio show that is inspired by Trivia Inspiration Radio. Today, we have a special guest, Miss Karen Gray Houston, who wrote the book Daughters of the Boycott about her amazing family and their journey through history. And so today, I'm going to ask her a lot of questions in regards to her memoir. And I hope each and every one of you have had a chance to pick one up and read it, so that if you have any questions, please inbox us and we can ask them to Miss Houston. Thank you for coming, Miss Houston.
Gwen, please call me Karen. I'm excited to be here, and I'm thrilled that you tracked me down through my husband's son's website, Afro Universe. So it's kind of a fun way for us to hook up.
Yes, it is. It's amazing. I was on Twitter, and I was actually, like I said to you before, I was posting about my brother. And so when he sent me a request, he was following me, and I'm like, wow. So that means that whatever I'm saying on Twitter must mean something to someone in the Afro world that, that is affecting our community. And I was so delighted that I actually posted on Facebook, like, can y'all believe this? That means I'm saying something that makes sense to someone. So I'm so glad to be a part of it. So can you just introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh my goodness. My name is Karen Gray Houston. I recently married, so I add my Nesbitt in my social life. Married a man named Bob Nesbitt, who I reconnected with after 40 years. That's a whole another long story. I am a journalist, author. I spent most of my career as a radio and TV news broadcaster, reporter. I worked in Boston, New York, and DC. My last 20 years was at WTTG TV in Washington, DC. And when I left there, I knew the last year that I was there that I had a project that I had to take on. And it was to write this memoir, Daughter of the Boycott. I had to write it because it's a thank you to my father, the late Judge Thomas Gray, and to his younger brother, civil rights attorney Fred Gray, and to a legion of unsung heroes and heroines who were involved in the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. I thank them because they really put their lives on the line and what they did opened doors of opportunity for me. And so I went on this 5-year quest journey to write this memoir, and I finally finished it, and it's out in the world.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't it amazing to finally get it done and accomplished? But not only that, it's a teaching tool for everyone. Isn't it a great feeling?
It's a wonderful feeling. And
Yeah.
I recently went back to my old high school in
Yes.
Cleveland, Ohio. Well, actually, I went to Shaker Heights High School, and
Yes.
I had heard from a couple of the teachers at the school who are teaching African American history and literature of the Black experience, two classes that were unheard of when I was a student there back in the mid to late 60s. And so I was
Yes.
happy to see that there's an interest in that kind of material, and that at least some schools in America are trying to find out what's going on in our world, and that our stories are being digested and people care.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because that was one of the questions that I was going to ask you. And we talked about that. Is about you visiting your school, Shaker Heights High School in Ohio. And we talked about the teacher's class, the history class, African American experience. So, can you like let the audience, let our listeners know some of the questions that the students asked you that you found fascinating, that they were interested in history, as well as
Well,
which one would.
here's what I found, and I should tell you a little bit about Shaker Heights High. When I was there in the 60s, we had a much smaller percentage of African American students. The student, like in most big big city schools now, there are more people of color percentage wise. And so, but there were some white students who were interested in asking questions. They wanted to know, well, they had been front loaded a lot of the history that I didn't know. For example, the whole story about, the boycott and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. When I was in high school, most of the books that really have been written on that subject hadn't been written yet. And so we weren't really taught that at all. And so some of these kids knew, for example, about Claudette Colvin, the
Mhm.
15-year-old teenager who refused to give up her seat on a crowded bus to a white passenger in 1955 in the months before Rosa Parks. So they knew about her. They were inquisitive about the white allies that I wrote about in Daughter of the Boycott, because there were white people who almost turned their back on their races, and they were ostracized for helping to support Black people in the boycott. So there was some curiosity about that. They were also curious to know about what high school was like for me at their school years ago. And so there's some similarities when I was there. The administrators steered Black kids into the lower level achieving classes. And so the students, they had a level system, And so I told them that my parents, when I transferred to that school, had to fight to get me in the right classes because there was an expectation of low achievement. And they were saying that even though they have de-leveled the classes, they still feel as if there are many fewer African Americans in the advanced placement classes. So I guess they were saying the more things change, the more they stay the same.
They remain the same. And that's interesting that you bring that up because where I used to live in Eastern Henrico, Richmond, Virginia, and there was always an issue, and even in New York City, it's always an issue in the African American community where we always get Fs in our schools, even the elementary schools with the federal accreditation. So you could drive 30 minutes down the road, and all the schools on that side of town, which is the well-to-do side of town, always had like A pluses. And do you think it has anything to do with the fact that maybe we don't take the field trips? Maybe we don't have those type of books that would fascinate the kids with history. Like I'm fascinated with history, you're fascinated in history. You can't help it but be, as amazing as your story is. Do you think it's something extra that we need to do to, get the kids excited? Because even my daughter was in the special IB program, but the school altogether received an F. So what do we need to do to get everyone excited about history?
Okay, well, I'm going to start our whole conversation with Gwendolyn. I don't have the answers to all of your questions.
Okay.
But I think that parents have to stand up to get what their kids need in school, especially now when there are people out there burning books and banning books, and they've got these organizations that are trying to put their people into school boards to decide what parts of history your children need to learn. So back in the day, or when parents didn't feel the need to go to the schools and confront the people and hold them accountable, now is the time to stand up and speak out.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I think that's very important too. So I want to get back into your beautiful memoir. So let's talk a little bit more. Yes, let's talk some more about um, you had a family friend named Hillard, and he was shot by police on the bus. There's many sides to that story. Same thing with my brother. We have something similar to that, that there was many sides to his story. He died in police custody. Can you like get into a little bit about your relationship with Hillard to your family?
Hilliard Brooks was a young black man he was actually a friend of my dad's. They had played street football together as kids. They both served in the military. They were both in the Navy, and they both served during World War II. When they came out, my dad was teaching civics and math at a Catholic school where the American veterans had an organization training veterans. And Hilliard was taking classes there. Well, one day Hilliard went downtown to trying to get a ride on a bus, and like your brother Ray's situation, the circumstances are not perfect. There was this Hilliard created a scene on the bus, and he was drunk and disorderly, and there's no disputing that. Well, the white bus driver summoned a police officer. So, the police were all white, and the police officer came. Now, here's where the dispute is kind of hazy. There were a lot of eyewitnesses, but it's in dispute what exactly happened and how it happened. Some people say that the shooting happened on the bus. Some people say it happened when the police officer arrived and Hilliard was on the sidewalk. It doesn't really matter how it happened, but they had an exchange of words. Somebody said that Hilliard was pushed to the ground, and the police officer, when he tried to pull himself up, took his gun out and shot Hilliard. Hilliard was taken to the hospital where he later died. Circumstances, it's like with your brother. And here's the difference. Fast forward to when your brother was died. There were cameras everywhere. We have to go back to eyewitnesses. Who knows? There was nobody. The reporters weren't hanging out by the bus. But in your brother's situation, there were cameras, police body cameras in the back of the car, cameras where they took him to the hospital, outside the hospital, so you could see a lot of what went on. And so they didn't really know exactly what happened with Hilliard. But when my dad found out, he and the commander of that American Veterans Unit at St. Jude's School said, "This is outrageous." And they did the nice thing. They wrote a nice letter to the mayor and the police commissioner and some city officials. And they said, "Hey, we feel as if the police officer M.E. Mills, who fired the gun that killed Hilliard Brooks, ought to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Mm-hmm. And what happened? Nothing. And so when nothing happened, they also sent that letter to the local newspaper. And it ran in a column that was called something like "Tell It to Old Grandma" or whatever. So after that, they decided, okay, we need to make a better show of this to get some attention to it. So they organized, Dad and Commander Ron Young, they organized a big veterans march, and they had hundreds of veterans, and they marched downtown on Main Street, Dexter Avenue in downtown Montgomery. But they knew you couldn't have a whole bunch of Black people walking around on the streets in Montgomery without getting in trouble. It was, I don't think they had anything like a process to get a permit or whatever. And were they going to give a bunch of Black people a permit? I don't think so. So they said, what we're going to do is we're going to carry signs that say ballots will beat bullets. And the plan is we're going to march down. We're going to go to the courthouse. And those of you who have not registered to vote, go inside and register to vote. And that way they can't accuse us of loitering. So a lot of details in the book about what happened there. And there are some intimidation by the local law enforcement. But long story short, in the end, nothing really came of it. There was a newspaper article that said 50 Black people came and registered to vote, put in an application to register to vote. And there were about 300 other Black men who came to the court to try to petition for registration. But the
Right.
thing to read, nothing happened. You know, they just kind of, and they didn't mention the march or what the march was all about. But it was at a time when there were very few Black people registered to vote because why? They were disenfranchising Black people. They weren't making it easy for you to vote. They had poll taxes. They had these ridiculous literacy tests that you had to take. I
Mhm.
mean, even people like Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks tried to register to vote about 3 or 4 times before they let her register.
Yeah, that's amazing. And she was able to register to vote
Eventually, you know.
eventually. That's amazing. And talking about the sacrifices and everything in our community, do you feel that the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, by protesting and boycotting, would make a difference today, being that we're being disenfranchised?
Oh well, I'm not quite clear on the question. You know, we have laws in place, but look at what's happening right now there's another massive attempt to disenfranchise people
Yes.
of color and immigrants. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, what are you going to do about it? Well, the Southern Poverty Christians Center, Southern Poverty Law Center,
Yes.
filed lawsuits against 4 states recently to try to ease access to the ballot. And what this
Mhm.
Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, the usual suspects.
Yes.
Uh, and you know, you've got these state lawmakers and governors all over the country that
Okay.
are putting laws in place and doing things to keep Black, you know, doing some racial gerrymandering to
Right.
keep Black people's power away. And
Yes.
they're doing it because why? In 2045, according to the US Census, white people are going to be in the minority. And so this is like a last gasp, last minute power grab
Right.
by
Right.
conservative extremists to try to get some political power before it's too late.
Yeah, and I think that's what the main thing is this they were doing it very slow. And just recently, I would say the last year or two, I learned that some of them changed their bylaws where all you need is 1 or 2 people in the room now, and it's considered a meeting, and you can pass laws with just 2 people. So they really got some shenanigans going on in the back doors when it comes down to trying to maneuver around those laws. And I think, like you, is very important that we go out and vote because your family has made so many insurmountable contributions that have changed our lives.
I
And
like,
it,
yeah,
yeah,
I like to remind young people to vote. I mean, I can't believe that they don't. And I like to remind them that people died for us
yes,
to have the right to vote. And just look back at just the Selma to Montgomery March, when Black people were beaten back by police officers on horses. And they were
yes,
actually connected to that whole incident. 4 people died, a Black man and 3 white people who were supporting voting rights for African Americans. And so, you know, if people were willing to put their lives on the line to get you the power to vote, the privilege to do your civic duty, you ought to do it.
I believe so too. And there were times I would, when I lived closer to my voting precinct, excuse me, I would walk. That would be my honor and contribution to those who boycotted back in the days. I didn't drive, and it was close, but I didn't drive to my precinct to vote. And I always thought because it's a sacrifice. It truly is that people have died and suffered. So to go and walk to my voting precinct and come back with my little sticker on, it was like to my grandparents, to my other family members who have witnessed the colored water fountains and the white water fountain. And like you said, that you witnessed that too. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm so excited because I've had family members go through it, but I've never met someone who went through the whole experience and the whole amazing history to make history in regards to
Yeah, you have to be old like me to remember that. But anyway, and people now take integration for granted. But segregation was ugly. I mean, I was 4 years old during the bus boycott, but what was ugly, what was happening in Alabama and all throughout the Deep South, Black people were not allowed to go to white schools or restaurants or hotels or bathrooms. They set aside water fountains for white people only. So what we were living through was, legally sanctioned, government sponsored separation of the races by law. And that's the thing to remember. It's like there was an actual law. And I remember little things like taking a train ride. My mother's relatives lived in Louisiana. So we would take the train from Montgomery to Louisiana, but we would have to sit in the colored car. Colored car is usually the car on the train that's right next to the engine. So it's, less comfortable, hot, and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't go to the dining car to eat. So mom always packed our fried chicken and sandwiches.
Yeah.
There was that. We would take road trips, and when we take a road trip, we kind of knew word of mouth where you could go to eat in a restaurant, where you should buy your gas so you could go to the bathroom and it won't be horrible.
Right. Well, the Green Book, did you have to experience that as well?
I never saw a Green Book. I saw the movie. I loved the movie, and I guess that Green Book was out there, but it might have been just because my dad was in the know and knew the people, and
Right.
so we didn't use the Green Book. But I'm glad it was there for the people who could use it, needed it.
Yeah, you know what? And it's awesome you said that. Now, when you had to experience that, and you were born in a Negro hospital, a hospital for Negroes, is that hospital still around as a name change?
No, I did go looking for it, but there's just a vacant lot now. It was on a place called Lake Street. It didn't look like a modern day hospital. It looked like one of those old antebellum houses. It had a circular driveway, but the good thing, it was such a treat to have it. It was a place where Black doctors who couldn't get privileges at white hospitals and Black nurses could give Black people really the kind of care that they needed and that they weren't going to get if they went to the white hospitals. Some of the white hospitals would take you in, but they sometimes had a special wing in the hospital for the Black people. Come in the front door, you had to go around to the back. It might be up in the attic, it might be down in the basement someplace. And you just didn't get the same kind of treatment. So, when people talk about, well, what has changed? There's been some progress. I mean, you don't think about those kinds of things anymore. You just walk right up in the front door to a hospital and hope to get good treatment.
Right. And being in Negro hospital, just like with Farmville with Barbara Johns and Robert Russell Moulton School, how we had inadequate buses, school supplies, etc., including the gym. And so I know that Claudia Colvin made history by being a young person too, sitting on the bus and doing her part to bring some awareness to what was going on in Montgomery during that time, because we wouldn't know. We don't have Facebook and, all that other stuff that we do have now. So we wouldn't know unless a family member we spoke to or was in the newspaper, if you read the news or if you read it all. So I want to change the reset a little bit and ask you a little bit about the Thurgood Marshall, who was really good friends with your uncle, Mr. Fred Gray. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we'll talk a little bit about Fred Gray. Fred Gray was my dad's youngest brother, who was a man on a mission, went to Alabama State Teachers College for Negroes after he had gone to a boarding school to learn to be a preacher. Because back then if you went to college, you could be a preacher or a teacher. So he was going to be both of those. He wanted to go up to law school, and so that meant he had to go up to a school in the North that would admit Black people. And he decided he was going to go do that, and he was coming back to Montgomery. He's going to destroy everything segregated he could find. So when he gets back, and he's working with Rosa Parks at the NAACP, and E.D. Nixon, who was the head of the Montgomery branch of the organization. Mm-hmm. And when Claudette was arrested, my uncle thought, this is perfect. This is going to be a perfect test case of segregation on the buses. And so he had heard about Thurgood Marshall, famous lawyer in New York with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He called him, he went up to visit him, and he consulted with him about Claudette's case. And that just began a very long professional relationship that the two of them had. And he was lucky to have that. But my uncle knew, he was 23 years old, just out of law school in Ohio, the second Black attorney in Montgomery, Alabama. He knew he needed help, and he also got help from a white lawyer in Montgomery, Clifford Durr, who, mentored my uncle. And he and his wife, people describe them as, white do-gooders, Virginia Durr. They went with E.D. Nixon to bail Rosa Parks out of jail, because E.D. Nixon, who was like Mr. Civil Rights and probably the most prominent Black politician activist in Montgomery at the time, called the jail when he heard that Rosa Parks had been arrested. But they wouldn't talk to him because he was a Black man. So he called Clifford Durr, and Clifford and Virginia and E.D. Nixon went to the jail to bail Rosa Parks out.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like it's white is right and Black get back sort of thing. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the rest of your family, like your mother Juanita, what she do, your father, your brothers?
My dad was a businessman. He and a neighbor and a college buddy of his, William Singleton, owned a radio, TV, and appliance store in Montgomery. And back when TV was new, they were selling TV sets. And if you were Black in Montgomery and wanted to buy a major appliance, you would probably go to their store. It was called Dozier's. And for years later, my dad used to brag about the fact that he sold Martin Luther King and Coretta a couple of TV sets and a washing machine when they first moved to Montgomery. So dad also had a side gig. He was a radio announcer, and he was one of the first Black radio announcers in Alabama.
Yes, excuse me.
When the boycott started, he, we talked about the march he was involved in. Once the boycott started, he became an organizer. There was a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association that coordinated the day-to-day activities of the boycott. And my dad was on the founding board, along with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and, Ralph Abernathy and some people like that. So they worked very closely together. And he drove his own car. Dad had a green Plymouth. He loved those Plymouths. And he would pick people up, Black passengers, to keep them off the buses to make the boycott a success. But it was a massive carpool operation where a lot of people were driving their own personal cars. Yes. After a while, lots of money started flooding in from around the country and around the world. They could buy station wagons. Taxis were helping. Hearse funeral homes had hearses, and they were trying to get. So it was really an amazing effort. If you think back on it, there were about 40,000 Black people in Montgomery at the time.
Yes.
And more than 98% probably of the people did not ride the buses for the 382 days that boycott lasted, which is an amazing feat. I don't know. It's hard to get 5 people with the same opinion to go down to the street corner now. So it was a really big deal.
Yeah, you know what? And I was surprised by it too. I've done protests, I've knocked on doors, and so I know that it's you have to be on the same page, like you said, with the same mindset and same determination to get it done. You know what I mean? And to want to get out there and make a difference. And they always say we don't never help each other. We don't help our own kind out. You hear that a lot. And so to hear that, that's amazing. That is true.
Look back at everything. There was so much going on behind the scenes of that boycott. Way before it started, there were groups like, there was the NAACP, and E.D. Nixon was looking at boycotts in other cities, like Baton Rouge and Mobile, Alabama had some sort of unsuccessful boycotts by Black people on public transportation. There was a women's group. Joanne Robinson was a woman who headed up a group called the Women's Political Council. And they were all probably more radical than the male groups. When Claudette was arrested, they marched downtown and had meetings with the mayor and the the police
Okay.
commissioner, and they met with the man, the people who ran the bus company.
Okay.
They were really starting, and Joanne Robinson and another woman, Mary Fair Burks, they were teachers at Alabama State. They got their kids involved in this. The kids would they would send them out on buses, and when people had complaints about how bus drivers were treating them, they were taking down names and bus numbers and things like that. So
That's good.
there was a lot going on in a lot of different directions, and it all kind of came together when people got sick of. Well, there was Claudette. There were two other Black women and a Black teenage girl who were arrested for refusing to give up their seats before
Yes.
Rosa Parks.
Mhm.
So there were, and Rosa Parks was meeting with my uncle for lunch, talking about mapping strategy. We got to do something about this segregation. And so, uh,
And I want to ask
it
you,
all,
yes.
yes.
And so I want to ask you a question about Rosa Parks and how she became a factor in your lives after you finished telling us about your beautiful family, because I have written it down about the complaint. So I want to discuss that about how she was not on the complaint for the lawsuit for the desegregation of the buses.
So what happened with Rosa Parks was the day she was arrested, December the 1st, 1955,
Mm-hmm.
my uncle took her case, and it was a case, she was charged with disorderly conduct. And she was not charged with violating the segregation law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so her case was sort of making its way through the local court system. And then my uncle was saying, well, and he was, consulting with Thurgood Marshall and a guy, Robert Carter, and Clifford Durr. And they were saying, well, for this case, for us to have a test case that's successful, we got to get it out of the state of Alabama where these racist people are trying to keep folks down. So it's got to be a federal case. And so what my uncle did was filed a suit that involved Claudette Colvin and Susie McDonald and Aurelia Browder and Mary Louise Smith, and filed it in the federal court system. And that's the one that made its way through the courts and all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which struck down segregated busing. So basically, I mean, I love Rosa Parks, but she was not on the case that
Right.
struck down busing.
And that's so amazing, because I did not know that until I read your book. I always believed, like most of history, that she was the iconic individual or person who really started the entire boycott. And so that history, to find out that wasn't true, was so shocking to me at 54, And so, yeah.
Well, I went up to see Claudette. It took me years to get her to agree to an interview, but she lived in the Bronx in New York at the time. And we kind of talked about Rosa Parks and that whole situation. And she said she always felt like Rosa Parks stole her thunder, because she felt like she was the one who should have gotten more credit. But, Rosa Parks has all these memorials and statues and at the Capitol, and, streets named after her and all that kind of stuff. And, she's the mother of the civil rights movement. But what about Claudette? And Claudette for years was very reclusive and didn't talk about all these things. But in her older ages, she is now 82, I believe, decided that she was ready to let people know, hey, I played a part in this. And people should know that there were some other women who put their lives on the line, but, they had to go to court and testify about these things that happened. And so, they should get some credit. And Claudette is finally getting some credit. She's been mentioned in the congressional record. She last year went to a family court in Montgomery to petition to have her juvenile record expunged, because it never had been. I mean, she was charged with assault against a police officer because they said when we pulled her off the bus, she was kicking and clawing and scratching, and so they charged her with that and violating the boycott law and being a juvenile delinquent. And so, she was ostracized really after the events were all over and she could never get a job in Montgomery. So she moved to New York and she lived there for most of her life. But she finally decided, well, hey, I want to get some credit for what I have done, and I want them to strike that off my record. So she went, it was last fall, and I went down, she went into the courthouse, and it turns out a Black family judge was the one who, erased all that.
Her record. Oh, that's wonderful. But I want to get into just a little bit more, only because when I read her story, I was not only shocked and surprised, but number two, I was also comparing it to my brother's case, where they made his criminal record be the reason why he died. Not because they tased him 20 times, handcuffed and shackled, but because his criminal record was out there before the story was out there. So what we was reading in the newspapers and getting from the elected officials and law enforcement in Halifax, South Boston, it wasn't forthcoming. It took us 2 years to get our video. And
they
so
made judgments, yes.
Yeah.
Judgments about you. But the thing about Claudette, hers should have been a test case, but what happened with young Claudette? Mm-hmm. She got pregnant. And the Black officials who were, trying to get things done did not want the face of their fight against segregation to be a young teenaged unwed mother.
And that's the point I was trying to make. And then they said that she got into trouble more after that, so they had to put a face on it. But I noticed, I believe I might be mistaken, that the complainants on the complaint have a different hue of color. And Claudette was different. Can you explain that and why they want to put Rosa Parks in front of all the other complainants on the complaint and make her be history? Because in my perception, in my thinking, I guess, I would say that I think that we are being laughed at behind curriculum closed doors. And that's just something I'm throwing out there because someone like me would have never known, but there are people out there who know we're being taught history wrong. I know that your family has been really close to Martin Luther King. We share the same birthday as we talked on January 15, 1968. And I'm so honored. I remember also my grandmother had a picture of him because I had gotten it out of the trash can at McDonald's from Del Rey, which is now a historical place. And that's one of our first homes, my parents. But I want to get back to Claudette, though. It seemed as though colorism, because that was in my book, but somehow that was taken out of my book. And I want to talk about colorism and how colorism also play a part in our history, even today.
It's still a factor. And when I talked to Claudette about Rosa Parks, she said the reason Rosa Parks was chosen, she says Rosa was the chosen one. Rosa had light skin, straight hair. She was an adult. She was her manner was very subdued, and and it was more palatable to white people. Mm-hmm. Which there's probably some truth to that. The other women, Aurelia Browder was a dark-skinned Black woman, and her children say that E.D. Nixon and those other guys didn't want her out there because she was outspoken, loud, and dark-skinned. Yeah. There was another, Susie McDonald looked white. That's what got her in trouble. She looked white, and she would get on the bus and sit in the front where the white people were supposed to sit. On the buses, the first 10 seats on every bus were reserved for the white people, whether they were on the bus or not. Right. And so sometimes she would sit up there, and I guess the bus driver found out she was Black and that, that they had some issues, and she refused to move. And then there was another young girl, Mary Louise Smith Ware. Well, Ware's her, I guess, married name now. She was only 18 years old when she refused to give up her seat. And so theoretically, they could have formed a boycott around her case, but there were people who said that her father was a drunk and that they didn't want to be connected to a man who was an alcoholic. Family says the father wasn't an alcoholic, but whatever the case. And when I talked to her later, she told me, that she wasn't really mad that Rosa got the credit. She said, I was 18. I wouldn't have known what to say or,
Exactly.
So she's not upset that Rosie gets all the credit.
And I think it's awesome that we are sharing in history because it takes a village and it also takes a lot of us to carry that torch. So I was just surprised, but if it wasn't Claudette, it would have been Rosa. It would have been Rosa Parks. It would have been someone else. As long as we got uh, the history and the laws made to benefit us, I think it's a great thing to see that she carried that torch very well in history, and I'm just honored to talk to you about someone who know them personally. It's amazing. It's
Well,
really amazing.
I actually met Rosa Parks on occasion. She was friends with my family. They stayed in touch with her over the years, and she would visit my Aunt Pearl's house, and they would all go over and have dinner. And I have an autographed copy of her book, My Story. But I was so young, and whenever I was in her presence, I wasn't smart enough or old enough to really have a conversation with her about her accomplishments and what they really meant.
Yeah.
But I was just kind of happy to know her.
I think
Here's the other thing about Rosa Parks. She was not a little old lady who was tired on the bus that day. Rosa Parks was I'm going to call her a warrior. She was an activist from early on, and I did a lot of my research. I mean, aside from talking to family members and my uncle, who was talking to her and mapping strategy and all that kind of stuff. Even early on, as a young child, she and her mom, the father wasn't around, so they lived for a while with her mother's parents in Pine Level, Alabama, and back in the time when the Ku Klux Klan was roaming around the neighborhoods and burning
Yeah.
crosses and intimidating people. And when they would go to sleep at night, her grandfather would stay up and sit in the living room with a big long gun. And sometimes Rose Parks said she would sit up with him because she wanted to be there when he shot a Kluxer.
Yeah, that's
So that
amazing.
was that. And there are a lot of little stories that I tell you that I learned from doing the research at the Library of Congress, which is the repository of her papers.
Okay.
We now have a big and wonderful exhibit. But when it took me 5 years to write this book. So early on, I was going to the library, and they were allowing researchers to come in and look at the letters that she was writing back and forth to her friends and relatives. And she was in later years, she journaled, she wrote a lot. And so there's a story, and I'm not going to tell you what the story is, but there's a story in there that will make you wonder if something bad that happened that she wrote about really happened to her, and maybe that was the impetus for her to become an
Yes.
activist.
Yeah.
But she worked for the NAACP. She was an investigator. She was an investigator. She went to NAACP conventions. She was not just the seamstress.
First lady on the bus, right? The
And
lady
she
that
wasn't,
was on the bus, right?
and she wasn't a little old lady, because when the boycott happened, she was 42 years old.
See, I didn't know that. She looks
Not
much younger.
not a little old lady.
Right. That's very young.
Mhm.
And so when you say congressional, can you tell us about your dad and all his accomplishments and what he has received in life?
I'm
That
so proud of my dad. Well,
yeah.
when I was a teenager and a young kid, my dad and I were like this, because he wanted me to do some things and I didn't want to. He wanted me to be a lawyer and I wanted to be a journalist and things like that. But I was really proud of him. He, like my uncle, wanted to go to law school. Actually, he wanted to go to law school before my uncle, but he didn't because he was distracted by my mom in college. And so they got married and had a family. But after the boycott was over, he decided, well, we'll go up to Cleveland. He'll go to law school and get a degree and come back and work with my uncle, who was busy desegregating everything in the state of Alabama.
Right.
So he moved us to Cleveland, and he took the bar on several occasions in Alabama. He was never able to pass the Alabama bar. He could pass the Ohio bar, couldn't pass the. So, our thinking is, and my uncle always says it, that, those white officials in Montgomery were not going to let two black grays come down there and desegregate stuff and be
Right.
troublemakers.
Right.
So, Dad ended up having a really remarkable career as a civil rights attorney
Okay.
in Cleveland. And he was known for his practice of poverty and fair housing law. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't as if the Mason Dixon line stopped in the South. In Cleveland, they had this other practice of steering black people into ghettos. And, stubborn. So Dad litigated against really a stubborn practice of segregated housing in and around the Cleveland metro area.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he has been rewarded for all those years that he did. He did that, and then he did ultimately. He and my mom moved back to Alabama. Dad got a federal appointment as an administrative law judge in Montgomery, the city that wasn't going to let him go to law school. Now the feds are going, okay, we're going to make him a judge. So I was happy about that. But
Yeah.
recently, actually earlier this month, his law school inducted him into their Hall of Fame. And so it was the Cleveland Marshall College of Law in Cleveland. However, just this past it's just been this past week, Gwen,
Yeah.
they have changed the name of that law school because the
Mm-hmm.
Marshall in the Cleveland Marshall was named after the late Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who was a brilliant jurist, but he was a slaveholder. He
Okay.
owned hundreds of slaves and he never sold them. He never freed them. He would
Mm-hmm.
buy and sell them and, treating, human beings like property. And the school finally decided, after somebody petitioned them to take a good look at it, that they would that
Right.
doesn't reflect their values. If they're now talking about diversity and inclusion, why should they be named after this man who owned slaves? And so they are now the Cleveland State University College of Law.
Okay,
So
you know
that's
what? That's excellent. And we talked about that. I thought that was amazing. And also, he's named after the Black Thurgood Marshall, which is sort of like, you can confuse the two if you don't know your history very
great.
well.
A lot of people didn't know who the school was named after, but
Yeah.
now it's clear.
Yeah, yeah. And we talked about the statues. I wasn't part of the process with Mayor Stoney in Richmond, but I was part of the Zooming of reframing Virginia, reframing it after they was taking the statues down. So I would host Zoom meetings with him and have people come on that really want to make change. I met a lot of great people. So it was great to be a part of that process to not only watch the statues coming down, but also to question him what's next. Because how are you going to replace something that you couldn't put a black person up other than all the ash, but also tell the true history because there's not enough a monument to put down what really happened and why the statue was there. And we talk about Jefferson Davis because you have a Jefferson Davis where you're from, and we have a Jefferson. We used to have a Jefferson Davis where we are now. I think it's called Richmond Highway 1. Can you
Right.
yeah, is it still Jefferson Davis where you are in Alabama?
Well, in Montgomery, the street that my dad and uncle, I call my Uncle Fred Uncle Teddy, that the
Right.
street that they grew up on was called Jefferson Davis, Jeff Davis Avenue.
Yes.
And recently, the mayor, the new, he's not new anymore, African American mayor of Montgomery, Stephen Reed, waged this campaign to change the name of that street and to honor a civil rights legend instead of a Confederate, president. And so that street is now Fred D. Gray Avenue.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? That's so beautiful. It's like it's about time. And we had that done here in Richmond with our 13. They called 13 and they were all sitting at, I believe it was Tolheimer's or Montgomery Ward, the store. And they were
Uh-huh.
not served lunch. Yeah, and they all got records like Claudia and Claudette Cloven, excuse me.
Mhm.
And they were able to get it exonerated thanks to the NAAC president, J.J. Minor in Richmond, Virginia. So they have honorable signs up honoring their names throughout Richmond, and that's close to Maggie Walker's historical home as well. So that's a beautiful thing. But is It's better late than never. So I just want to try to wrap this up. My battery is going low. I want you to, yes, I want you to talk about your 41 year career in journalism. And is there something you can inspire everyone who might want to get into journalism, and also to throw something in there to let them know that you were also the White House correspondent for Ronald Reagan. And
Uh,
that's exciting.
so it was, you know, the law was not my calling, even though my uncle and my father wanted me to go in that direction.
Yes.
My first job was at United Press International in Boston in 1973. I graduated from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. So I got my master's degree, and an unsolicited letter from UPI saying, "Hey, you know, what are you going to do now that you have that degree?" So that was my first job, and ironically, I was there on the radio after that doing reporting on busing desegregation. I mean, all those years after the desegregation in the South, I'm busy doing that up there. So there was that. I worked at a radio station. I anchored on the ABC radio network. I moved to the White House and worked for NBC and covered Ronald Reagan. And I worked for an all news radio station in DC, and then finally spent 20 years working at WTTG TV. So
Yeah.
I don't envy the people who are now trying to cover the news, because there's so much disinformation out there, and they're really challenged to get the, you know,
Yeah.
you talk about the power of the pen. Yeah, I believe in the power of the pen if you're using it to speak truth. And so right now, that's a challenge. I don't envy any of my former colleagues for trying to report the news fairly and accurately.
Yes, and that was one of the questions that I had for you, is that the power of the pen can also distort and write us out of history. Do you, when you read a lot, I know you read a lot. I've seen you on your Twitter because I'm a follower. And do you feel that, being that you were on the front lines of it all, do you see, read, or feel that some parts of our history is still being written out? Or
Yes, they're
accurately?
banning and burning books, Gwendolyn.
Yeah.
The people are going to the school board saying, we don't want this. They're trying to whitewash the history because they feel like news about, slavery, stories about slavery are making the white children uncomfortable. Uh, that is insane. Well, so whoever writes the history creates the narrative. And so I'm happy to see people like you and me and a lot of other folks telling our stories, because if we don't tell them, they're going to be lost
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
or revived.
You know, it's so amazing. You said a quote, and I wrote it down about how it's just phasing out, you know. And so I was like, wow. And that's how I feel too sometimes with the, what is it, 16, 19, how they just do not want our history to be told because they weren't part of it. But yet, some people, whether they are allies or not, they're still benefiting from those staples of segregation, racism, lynch laws, Jim Crow. Do you have any response to that at all?
Well, slavery, we're still on this continuum from slavery. Then there was that little dot segregation. I mean, we're just kind of passing on and continuing on. Uh, I, the, the the fight continues. I mean, we can't just roll over and act like nothing is happening. So, I can't do it by myself, and you can't either. But
Right.
we need to encourage people to get out there and tell some stories, and yeah, don't let them burn these books and ban them. That's outrageous. You don't like the story, so you're going to burn the book.
Right, but that's how you that's how we got into Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, and people like your father and your uncle who were able to change those laws. And this is my last question to you. Do you feel that we have benefited by integrating schools?
Oh, yes. I would say yes, except look at where we when I was in school. I mean, I've attended some integrated schools, And then there was the whole fight to integrate the schools with busing and all uh,
Yeah.
that was just, and some of that resulted in violence and all that.
Yes.
So what happened was after white people looked up and went, oh, we don't want to be integrated with the black people, they started creating these white academies and taking their kids out of the public schools. And so, I mean, since Brown versus Board of Education, it took years and years and years to try to implement this integration of the schools. And now we're at a point where if you look at major urban area schools all over the country, they have been resegregated. They're
Yes.
mostly people of color, and the white people have gone off and gone to their own schools. And so
Yeah.
they're missing out on the socialization and learning, the differences and appreciating the differences in our cultures.
Yes, and that's an amazing thing. That's why we go on vacation sometimes, because we don't want to have to eat the same thing and see the same thing all the time.
Right.
How the universe created us so differently in our own unique way. And for someone to try to control that and make it just one for all, or either just one for separate but not equal, it's a disservice to everyone who's born on the planet who come here to love, to sacrifice, to maintain, and to grow, and to take that civil liberty from you is just mind blowing sometimes that people feel that it's okay on a grand scale. And so I've read even in Petersburg, Virginia, where the kids are going to AP Hill Elementary School. AP Hill was one of the Confederate soldiers, and he has the only statue that's still up in Richmond, Virginia, in the roundabout. It's AP Hill because he's buried underneath it. So Mayor Stoney has to look at it differently. Excuse me. So with that being said, I want to wrap this up. Thank you so much. I
Thank you
appreciate
for having me. I enjoyed our conversation, Gwendolyn.
you too. Excuse me. And I will call you later. Excuse
We'll
me.
chat. I wanted to
Yes.
Allow us at Eddie B Productions to capture, create, and celebrate all of your greatest moments. Let us turn your joy into memories that will last forever. As we remember our beloved Eddie Blick Jr., the very reason we do it all, we aim to put a smile on your face and also your heart. Whether a birthday party, wedding planning, organizing an event, or photography, we can service all your needs. You can follow us on Instagram at Eddie B Productions, email us at eddie_productions93@outlook.com, or call us at 410-303-0101 for all your event planning, decoration, fun, and photography needs. We look forward to working with you.